can you explain to us what it actually means to operate under a principles-based act as opposed to the previous 1989 Act?
So a principles-based act is about actually picking up the principles in the Act and seeing how they apply to your community. So instead of the prescription that was there in the 89 Act, you pick up the principles, and there's 5 areas for those principles. There's community engagement, strategic planning, financial management, public transparency, and service performance. How do you apply those in your community in a way that makes sense to your community, so that you're delivering the outcomes for your community in accordance with principles instead of prescription?
So Stephen Cooper, what are the key differences between the 2020 Act as it relates to councillor integrity and the previous Act of 1989?
I think, Chris, there's some areas around accountability and culture that are more strongly addressed in the 2020 Act through the application of principles rather than the prescriptive approach of the 1989 Act. So that goes to really a far greater level of clarity of responsibilities for the council, the mayor, and the chief executive officer. So the fact that the 2020 Act talks about the role of the council and what good governance means in Section 8, that it will follow the governance principles of Section 9 and that councillors will comply with the requirements of Section 28 in terms of the responsibilities of councillors. They are really strong statements. Chris, in terms, moving on further, the role of the mayor in supporting councillors and councillor conduct has been strengthened in this Act. Again, so there is a strong signal that the mayor has a really important leadership role. But that also sends a signal in terms of councillors as their obligation to be part of the councillor team and to act in accordance with those good governance principles. And equally then, the role of the CEO continues to be well defined, and that requirement that the role of councillor doesn't include the role of the CEO continues. But in that broader, stronger framework of the principles of good governance, I suppose.
Are each of those principles as important as the next, or do you expect to see a greater focus on some as opposed to others?
So look, they're all equally important. However, community engagement will drive so much of the delivery of the other principles. So it's really important when you're thinking about your community engagement policy, when you're undertaking community engagement, how is that integrated with the other the other principles, and how you're going to deliver in accordance with those principles through your engagement. Public transparency, of course, is absolute primacy for councillors, ensuring that the process that you have in place to make your decisions is absolutely clear in relation to what the public can expect and what documents they can see and how they can access those documents, and how your governance is arranged to deliver that in a way that is responsive to the community, and doesn't look like you're trying to hide anything.
Kerry, what are the key considerations, do you think, for people in interpreting the principles-based Act?
I think they're going to think about it as an opportunity for them to develop their own policy and programs for their communities, and just focus on a key group of principles that work for that council and for that community. And that means that it's not so prescriptive, it's not regulator based, which is what was the previous Act. So it's really working together. This will also absolutely lift the role of the mayor, and where there's a deputy mayor, the role in leadership in that space. It also is very important on how you work with your community and what you do. And it does put the community at the centre of all the thinking when we talk about a principle-based Act. And there are some key strategic documents that need to be approved in the first year. There's a community vision, there's a council plan, a financial plan, and an asset plan. And they're fundamental. And the way you drive those through will be back to that principle. This is all tied up, this sort of strategic approach. So there will be that little bit of discomfort about, oh, why isn't written regulation wise about what I have to do? But I think if you can set those principles, and one of your principles might be absolutely how you're going to work with the community and take them on the journey with you.
So when it comes to the principles, what role do you see local government of Victoria playing?
So our role is really to provide that support and assistance in accordance with what the sector is asking for to assist them in implementing the principles. So we provided some guidance on what each principle means and how you might apply that. And all the work that we're doing with the sector, we're referring back to the principles, we're showing how the principles are connected in each piece of work that we're doing, because there is never just one principle at play. There's often many principles at play in each piece of work that we're progressing on. So it's really, really important that we continue that conversation, and we will, and listen to the sector about what support they need in order to be effective in this principles-based environment.
How have the accountability mechanisms and requirements changed for councils under the new Act?
Yeah, Chris, I think there are a few sort of signals in the Act that accountabilities are changing. The fact that for the first time there was a mandatory candidate training module, and there is also a mandatory induction for new councillors, really sends a strong signal that there are expectations associated with the role. Otherwise, there's a few accountabilities that are tucked away inside the Act, which sort of further strengthen that. One of the really strong ones is that the role of the Mayor includes reporting back on performance against the council plan. Now, this is the first time that sort of requirement of council performance in the strategic plan, has ever been sort of sheeted back to the representative of the council to deliver. So there's a really strong signal in that high priority for the council is to engage itself in the development and delivery of the council plan.
Steve, do these new accountability provisions in the Act go to any particular level of detail that perhaps needs to be highlighted?
I think one of the really important issues, Chris, is that previously there were principles of councillor conduct, if you like, that the councillors were to interpret and include in their councillor code of conduct. A little bit more detail's gone into the 1989 Act, where, or in fact, the regulations now are quite specific in terms of standards of councillor conduct, which really have to be included in the councillor code of conduct, but provide a lot more detail than in the past around the sort of expectations of conduct for councillors. Why it's important that this be addressed is that, remember, we talked previously about the fact we've moved from a prescriptive to a principles-based Act. In issues like conflict of interest and confidential information, there's a requirement now that the councillors really respond to what they ought be expected to know in the case of confidential information, or what a reasonable person might say in regard to conflict of interest, as opposed to, again, that high level of prescription that was in the former Act. So really the councillors need to engage in these topics, and in that way really shape the culture for the organisations that they're leading.